My review shows your profit margins are too low. I've already identified at least 3 areas where costs can be reduced immediately, the sharply dressed man announced, tapping on his tablet screen. We'll begin with employee compensation. I sat across from him, momentarily speechless, as Brian Hayes, the newly appointed regional manager from Bratepaw Veterinary Partners, outlined how my 14-year career at Oakwood Animal Clinic had suddenly been recalculated to equal just 60% of my current salary. It's nothing personal, Dr. Langdon, just business, he added with a rehearsed smile. We need to bring your pay in line with industry standards. My name is Jessica Langdon. I'm 41 years old, and I've devoted my entire professional life to caring for the animals of Lexington, Kentucky. What began as a position at a small, family-run veterinary clinic right after vet school gradually became something far deeper, something I gave my whole heart and soul to. I was there as the clinic evolved from a modest 2-room setup into the trusted cornerstone of the community it is today. I understand this is a period of transition, I replied evenly, even though my heart was racing. When would these changes take effect? Starting next pay cycle, Brian answered, already turning his attention back to his tablet. We'll need your decision by Friday. When Dr. Harrington announced his retirement and decision to sell the practice, all of us had felt uneasy. Still, he reassured us that Bratepaw would preserve everything we stood for. They understand what we've built here, he had said during the announcement dinner. Now, just 3 weeks after the sale was finalized, I found myself forced to choose between accepting a drastic pay cut or leaving behind the place that had become like a second home, a place where I had trained every veterinary technician, where I knew hundreds of pets by name, and where clients specifically asked for me to care for their animals. I appreciate your honesty, I said, rising from my chair. You'll have my answer by Friday. Brian gave a brief nod without lifting his gaze. As I made my way toward the door, he called out, "Oh, and Jessica, we're rolling out a new scheduling system next week. The training manual has been sent to your email." Once outside his office, I stopped near the reception desk, where Valerie was updating patient records. She had been with us for 12 years, and the worried look on her face told me she already knew. You too? I asked quietly. She nodded. 30% cut and fewer hours. What are you going to do? I murmured, careful not to be overheard by the clients waiting nearby. Valerie glanced around the room, a golden retriever sitting patiently beside an elderly man, a woman gently holding a cat carrier, a child stroking a rabbit in her lap. I'm not sure yet, she said softly, but I have a feeling things are about to change here, and not in a good way. A quiet determination began to take shape inside me. This wasn't only about my paycheck. It was about everything we had built, everything we believed in. I looked around the clinic that had defined my life's work and realized something had to change. To me, being a veterinarian has never been only about medical skill. It's about connection, not just with animals, but with the people who love them. Over the past 14 years, I had vaccinated puppies and, years later, helped those same dogs pass peacefully. I had written handwritten sympathy cards after painful losses and celebrated incredible recoveries. My personal phone number sat in countless contacts under Dr. Jessica for emergencies. The walls of my apartment were covered with thank you notes and photos of animals I had treated. My refrigerator was filled with drawings from children whose pets I had helped save. These weren't merely clients, they were meaningful, lasting relationships. You've worked with Bratepaw before, haven't you? I asked Thomas, our newest veterinarian, during lunch the following day. At 32, he had joined us 6 months earlier after leaving a corporate practice in Nashville. He gave a grim nod. 3 years, he said. It always follows the same pattern. Cost-cutting first, then efficiency measures, and eventually pressure to upsell services. And what about the quality of care? I asked, though I already had a sense of the answer. It becomes all about the numbers, he replied. How many patients you can see in an hour, how many extra services you can push, how much revenue you generate. He poked at his salad. That's why I left. I got tired of being told to recommend unnecessary dental procedures just to hit monthly targets. Later that afternoon, during a break between appointments, I called Dr. Harrington. After 30 years in practice, he had retired to a lakeside cabin, spending his days fishing and finally writing the veterinary memoir he had always dreamed of. "I had no idea, Jessica," he said, his voice heavy with regret. Their representatives assured me they respected the clinic's culture. I would never have sold if I'd known. "It's not your fault," I told him gently. "You earned your retirement. I just need to decide what comes next." "What are you thinking?" he asked. I paused. The idea had been forming quietly in my mind, but saying it out loud would make it real. "I'm thinking about opening my own practice." The silence on the line lasted only a moment. "You should," he finally said. "You've got the experience, the client relationships, and Lexington could use a clinic that still puts care above corporate margins." After we hung up, I sat in my office, looking at the degrees and certifications on the wall. My mind drifted to conversations with clients over the years, many of whom had expressed how grateful they were that we weren't one of those assembly line vet clinics. My thoughts were interrupted by a knock. It was Maggie, our head technician for the past 8 years. "Sorry to bother you, Dr. Langdon, but Mrs. Peterson is here with Baxter. She specifically asked for you, even though she's technically scheduled with Dr. Morris today." "Tell her I'll be right there," I said, standing up. As I prepared to examine the 10-year-old beagle I'd been treating since he was a puppy, I realized what I needed to do. The decision wasn't just about my salary anymore. It was about preserving something that mattered. Friday morning arrived with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. I had spent my evenings researching commercial real estate, equipment costs, and small business loans. I'd called 3 former colleagues who had successfully established their own practices. The more I explored the possibility, the more right it felt. I knocked on Brian's door at precisely 9 o'clock. "Come in," he called, his voice distracted. I entered to find him video conferencing with someone, his back half turned to the door. "I'll call you back," he told the screen before swiveling to face me. "Jessica, good. Have you made your decision?" "I have," I replied, handing him an envelope. "This is my 2 weeks' notice." His professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing genuine surprise. "You're quitting over a standard market adjustment?" "I'm pursuing a new opportunity," I corrected him, "and I wanted to inform you properly, with time to arrange coverage for my patients." Brian leaned back in his chair, studying me. "You know, I expected this reaction from some of the support staff, but not from you. You're a senior veterinarian. This is how corporate acquisitions work. Everyone needs to adjust." "I understand business realities," I said carefully, "and I've made a business decision of my own." He shrugged, already reaching for my resignation letter. "We'll have HR prepare your exit paperwork. I assume you'll be joining another practice." "Something like that," I answered vaguely. The news of my resignation spread through the clinic like wildfire. By lunchtime, Valerie, Maggie, and Thomas had all found moments to pull me aside. "Is it true?" Valerie asked, her voice barely above a whisper as we stood by the filing cabinets. "Yes," I confirmed. "My last day is 2 weeks from today." "What will you do?" she pressed. I hesitated before deciding to trust her with the truth. "I'm opening my own practice. I've been looking at a space over on Maple Avenue." Her eyes widened. "Really? She glanced around and lowered her voice further. "That's amazing, Jessica." Throughout the day, similar conversations followed. Thomas expressed interest immediately. "Keep me posted," he said meaningfully during a brief moment between patients. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, making lists and plans. My phone buzzed with a text from Maggie. "Whatever you're planning, count me in." It wasn't until my 3rd cup of tea that the severity of what had happened earlier hit me. As I was leaving for the day, Mrs. Davidson had stopped me in the parking lot. Her man, Oliver, had been my patient since she adopted him 6 years ago. "I overheard one of the texts saying you're leaving," she said, genuine distress in her voice. "Is it true?" When I confirmed it, her response was immediate. "Where are you going?" "Because Oliver and I will follow you there." That simple declaration of loyalty made me realize something I hadn't fully appreciated before. I wasn't just a veterinarian to these people and their pets. I was their veterinarian. And that bond meant something Bratepaw had severely undervalued. Staring at my notes, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about refusing an unfair pay cut anymore. This was about creating something better, a practice that would honor the trust these families had placed in me. The next 2 weeks were the longest of my career. I maintained absolute professionalism, treating each animal with the same care I always had, but an undercurrent of tension ran through every interaction with management. Brian had taken to hovering during my appointments, clipboard in hand, making notes about efficiency opportunities. He scheduled an exit interview for my final day and emailed daily reminders about my continuing obligation to non-solicitation of clients and employees, a clause that, upon review with a lawyer friend, turned out to be largely unenforceable in Kentucky. What Brian didn't know was that I'd already signed a lease on a storefront just 7 minutes across town. The space had previously been a pediatrician's office, meaning much of the necessary infrastructure was already in place. I'd secured financing through a local bank where I'd been a customer for over a decade, and equipment suppliers I'd worked with for years offered favorable terms for the new practice. We value relationships, too, my medical supplier rep told me during a discreet lunch meeting, and frankly, we've seen what happens to quality when Bratepaw takes over. We're happy to support independent practices. In the clinic, I maintained a careful silence about my plans, but word was spreading regardless. Clients would ask pointed questions during appointments. So, where exactly will your new practice be located? Mrs. Thompson asked while I examined her terrier's ear infection. I haven't finalized anything yet, I replied carefully, aware of the microphone on the computer system that had been installed the previous week as part of Bratepaw's quality assurance program. She lowered her voice. Well, when you do, please let me know. Max won't see anyone else. These conversations happened daily, and each one strengthened my resolve. I wasn't just making a career move. I was preserving a standard of care that mattered to the community. On Wednesday of my final week, Brian called me into his office again. His demeanor had changed, the corporate confidence replaced by barely concealed irritation. Several clients have been asking about your future plans, he said, without preamble. I need to remind you of your contractual obligations. I'm aware of my obligations, I replied calmly. And I've been clear with everyone that I don't have concrete plans to announce. He tapped his pen against the desk. We've invested considerably in acquiring this practice, Dr. Langdon. Bratepaw won't look kindly on any attempts to undermine that investment. I understand, I said. Is there anything else? He studied me for a moment. We're prepared to reconsider your compensation package. Perhaps we were too aggressive with the initial adjustment. The offer caught me off guard. It was the first sign that perhaps Bratepaw was recognizing their miscalculation, but it was too late. The lease was signed, equipment ordered, and my vision for Riverbank Animal Hospital was already taking shape. I appreciate that, Brian, but my decision is made. Later that afternoon, Valerie slipped a folded note onto my desk. Inside was a list of 20 client names with a simple message. These people called today specifically asking about you. At the bottom, she'd added, when you're ready to hire a receptionist, call me first. That evening, I met Thomas and Maggie at a coffee shop several miles from the clinic, far enough to avoid running into anyone from Bratepaw. Over lattes, I finally shared my plans in detail. I've secured a location on Riverbank Drive, I told them. It'll be called Riverbank Animal Hospital, opening in about 6 weeks if everything goes according to schedule. 6 weeks. Maggie repeated, her expression thoughtful. My reduction in hours takes effect in 3. Interesting timing. Thomas leaned forward. What's your staffing plan? I need a veterinarian who shares my philosophy of care, I said, meeting his gaze directly, and an experienced lead technician. Their smiles told me everything I needed to know. By the time we left the coffee shop, my new practice had unofficially gained its first team members. The pieces were falling into place, but I had no idea that Bratepaw was about to force my hand in a way I never anticipated. My second-to-last day at Oakwood began with an unwelcome surprise. Posted on the break room bulletin board was a new fee schedule, effective immediately, with price increases averaging 30% across all services. Basic vaccinations that had cost $45 were now $65. Dental cleanings jumped from $300 to $425. More disturbing were the new care packages, highlighted in bold, bundled services that included tests rarely needed for healthy animals. The comprehensive wellness package included 3 separate screens that most pets simply didn't require at routine visits. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore," whispered Jenna, a young vet who had joined us just before the acquisition. "Dr. Morris already told me we need to recommend the premium package to every client today." My stomach tightened. This wasn't just corporate streamlining anymore. This was exploitative. When Mrs. Whitaker brought in her elderly cat, Chairman Meow, for his arthritis check, I found myself in an impossible position. The new protocols required me to recommend a full senior panel costing nearly $500, despite having run the same tests just 2 months earlier. "Is this really necessary so soon?" Mrs. Whitaker asked, her concern evident. Living on a fixed income, she budgeted carefully for her cat's care. "The new owners have implemented standard protocols," I explained carefully, "but in my professional opinion, given Chairman's recent normal results, we could wait another 4 months for these particular tests." She looked relieved, but my compromise was short-lived. Brian had apparently been monitoring the appointment through the new electronic system. He entered the exam room before I could complete the visit. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm Brian Hayes, Regional Manager." He introduced himself with a practiced smile. I couldn't help noticing that we haven't scheduled Chairman's senior wellness package today. What followed was a masterclass in pressure tactics, subtle implications that skipping these tests was neglectful, mentions of catching problems early, and finally the closing offer of a special one-time discount that still exceeded what these tests should actually cost. I watched Mrs. Whitaker's expression changed in layers, confusion first, then a flicker of guilt, and finally a quiet resignation, as she eventually agreed, tightening her grip around her purse. After she left, Brian pulled me aside, his tone already sharpening. "Dr. Langdon, when we recommend a protocol, we expect full compliance from our veterinarians." I kept my voice low, controlled but firm. "Those tests aren't necessary right now." His reply was immediate, clipped. "This isn't about healthcare, it's about revenue." I shook my head slightly. "It is about healthcare." "No," he countered coldly. "It's about standardized care. Your personal attachment to clients is interfering with your professional judgment." The absurdity of it almost pulled a laugh out of me. "What you call personal attachment is called trust. It's the reason this clinic has functioned successfully for decades." He glanced at his watch like I was already irrelevant. Fortunately, we only have to manage that approach for 1 more day. From there, the rest of the day blurred into the same pattern, Brian hovering, interrupting appointments, and stepping in whenever I didn't enforce the new protocols aggressively enough. By closing time, I was drained. While updating Chairman Meow's file, something caught my attention that sent a chill through me. Buried in the administrative notes was a line, "Patient transfer to Dr. Morris effective immediately. Dr. Langdon no longer primary veterinarian." I checked others. Long-time patients, gone from my care list, reassigned without warning. Before I'd even left. That night, sleep never came easily. I had planned to leave quietly, set up my new practice, and then inform my clients from a stable position. But Brightpaw's tactics had shifted everything. At 2 a.m., I made a choice. I opened my laptop and emailed the lawyer helping me establish my clinic. "Need to accelerate timeline. How soon can we open, even in limited capacity?" The reply arrived faster than expected. "With temporary equipment rental and flexible scheduling, possibly 2 weeks. Call me in the morning." I shut the laptop and finally let my body relax. Tomorrow would be my final day at Oakwood Animal Clinic, and it wouldn't unfold the way Brian Hayes expected. The day arrived carrying a strange mix of endings and beginnings. I had spent the early hours preparing, making calls, and setting plans in motion. Now, parking in my usual spot for the last time, I felt unusually steady. The morning passed in emotional waves, goodbyes from staff who had become family over the years. Even newer employees, those who barely knew me, seemed affected by the shifting atmosphere. "The schedule looks light today," Valerie said at reception. Only 4 appointments were on my list, unusual for a Friday. Brian blocked most of it for transition work. I explained. Apparently, I've got a lot of paperwork before I leave. What neither of us said out loud was already clear. My regular clients had been quietly reassigned to other veterinarians. At noon, Brian summoned me to the conference room for what he called a departure protocol meeting. I expected routine exit formalities, returning keys, final signatures, maybe a brief acknowledgement of years of service. Instead, I walked in and found him seated with two unfamiliar people. One was introduced as BrightPaw's regional legal counsel, the other their human resources director. Before we move forward with finalizing your exit, there are a few matters we need to address, Brian said, his voice tight with formality. We've received information suggesting you intend to open a competing clinic, which would breach your employment agreement. The legal counsel, a rigid woman in her 50s, slid a sheet of paper across the table toward me. This is a cease and desist notice, she stated coldly, concerning any attempt to practice veterinary medicine within a 20-mile radius of this facility for a duration of 1 year. I glanced at the document, but made no move to pick it up. I don't remember ever agreeing to a non-compete clause, I said. It was included in the transition paperwork signed by all staff when BrightPaw took over the practice, she replied without hesitation. I reached into my bag. Actually, I kept copies of everything I signed. There's no non-compete clause anywhere in those documents. I placed my folder on the table. My attorney reviewed them yesterday and confirmed the same. A noticeable tension spread through the room almost instantly. On top of that, I continued, steady and controlled. Kentucky law places strict limits on enforcing non-compete agreements for medical professionals, veterinarians included, especially when it can affect patient care. The lawyer and the HR director exchanged a quick look. Brian's earlier confidence cracked slightly. We're not here to argue legal interpretations, Brian said quickly. We just want a smooth handover for the clients. Your clients, I corrected gently, holding his gaze. And I fully agree that their care should continue without disruption. Sensing the shift, the HR director softened her tone. Dr. Langdon, you've dedicated many years to this clinic. Perhaps there's a middle ground we can agree on that suits everyone involved. I offered a small, calm smile. I'm always willing to consider fair solutions. What followed was 2 hours of negotiation that eventually settled into something straightforward. I agreed not to actively approach or solicit Oakwood clients for 30 days, and in return, BrightPaw agreed to withdraw any effort to restrict where or when I could practice. By the time everything was finalized, my time at Oakwood Animal Clinic had officially come to an end. I gathered my personal items, exchanged final goodbyes, and walked out to my car carrying both nostalgia and anticipation for what was ahead. As I pulled out of the parking lot, my phone buzzed with a message from Valerie. I just heard Brian on a call with corporate, she wrote. He said, she's only one veterinarian. How much difference could her leaving really make? I stared at the message for a moment, then typed back a short reply. We'll see. What Brian and BrightPaw failed to understand was that I wasn't reacting. I was already ahead of them. Everything was already set in motion, and there was no stopping what was coming next. Exactly 17 days after I left Oakwood, Riverbank Animal Hospital opened its doors. The plan had been aggressive from the start, demanding non-stop effort, rented equipment, and a small team working exhausting double shifts, but we made it work. Thomas joined as my fellow veterinarian. Maggie came on board as lead technician after her reduced hours at Oakwood shifted her into part-time, and she committed fully to the new clinic. Valerie submitted her resignation on the very day the newly installed reception desk was set up, formally stating in her letter that BrightPaw had created a hostile work environment. The first day of operations was planned as a gentle soft launch, intended to trial our systems with only a small number of appointments before the official opening the following week. Personally, I had only reached out to around 20 long-term clients whose pets required ongoing care that I had already been managing. At 8:45 a.m., just 15 minutes before we were supposed to open, I glanced out of the front window and froze at what I saw, a long queue of people with their pets stretched through our parking area and spilling onto the sidewalk. Thomas turned to me in disbelief and asked if I had contacted all of them. I told him, just as shocked, that I hadn't. I had only called a handful with urgent cases. By then, Valerie was already stationed at the reception desk, logging into the new practice management system, and she simply remarked with a knowing smile that word must have spread quickly. As we unlocked the doors, a flood of familiar clients came in. Mrs. Peterson arrived with Baxter the Beagle, the Garcias came in with their 3 rescue cats, and Mr. Johnson brought along his very old tortoise, Methuselah. These were people I had treated for years, some for decades. Mrs. Peterson explained that she had seen the announcement on a community Facebook page and said no one wanted to miss the opening. By midday, we had already entered more than 70 pets into the system, and by the time we closed, that number had more than doubled. Every client seemed to share the same sentiment. They were following their veterinarian, not a clinic brand. What stayed with me most were the small, thoughtful gestures. Clients arrived with homemade cookies, handwritten congratulations cards, and small gifts to celebrate the new practice. One family even showed up carrying pizza for the entire staff to share for lunch. That evening, after an exhausting yet deeply rewarding first day, I received a message from a former colleague still employed at Oakwood stating that an emergency meeting had been scheduled for the next morning because the appointment book had suddenly gone empty. The following week far exceeded any expectations I had imagined. We were forced to extend our hours and quickly bring in additional staff just to manage the growing number of patients. By the end of the first month, we had registered more than 800 pets in our system, around 70% of Oakwood's former clients. What surprised me most wasn't just how many people followed us, but how they found us. We had barely advertised, relying almost entirely on word of mouth and a simple notice in the local paper. Despite that, new clients continued arriving daily, often saying they had heard about us through friends, neighbors, or local social media groups. One client told me while I was examining her Labrador puppy that the neighborhood pet forums had been buzzing about the new clinic and that everyone was talking about how I had stood up to a corporate chain. I never intended to become a symbol of resistance against corporate veterinary medicine, but somehow that idea took hold. People began sharing stories of BrightPaw's new pricing structures and strict protocols, contrasting them with our transparent fees and individualized care. 3 months after opening, I received an unexpected visit from Dr. Harrington, my former mentor and the previous owner of Oakwood. He toured the clinic and admitted he wanted to see it for himself. As he looked around with clear approval, he told me I had created something truly special. While walking through the practice, staff and clients warmly greeted him, many expressing how much they missed him but also how satisfied they were with the new direction. As we finished the tour, he quietly admitted that selling to BrightPaw had been a mistake and that he should have approached me first. I reassured him that everything had unfolded as it was meant to. Later that same day, I received an email that brought everything full circle. It was from Brian Hayes, requesting a meeting to discuss the veterinary landscape in Lexington. I couldn't help but smile as I replied that I was available next Tuesday at 2 p.m., keeping it simple. Nothing personal, just business. Standing in the middle of the thriving clinic we had built, surrounded by wagging tails, recovering patients, and a team I trusted completely, I realized something important. Sometimes the greatest form of success isn't revenge itself, but building the place you were always meant to create.